Welcome to dot point A2, which is describing the relationship between the ruminant and rumen microbes. So the ruminant animal, such as sheep and cattle, etc., are unique in a way. They have, four compartments to their stomach. Some people say they have four stomachs, but basically they have one stomach with four compartments, and they have microbes in their stomach which help to break down the food. So this is a unique thing that monogastrics don't have, and so we're going to look at what the relationship is between ruminant animal, such as cows and sheep, and the microbes that are in their stomach, in the rumen and the reticulum in particular. So first of all, we can see here that microbes break down feed to produce volatile fatty acids, which we'll look at in a second, which are used by the ruminants as energy for both maintenance and production. So the rumen microbes themselves only last for a couple of days, and they only live for a couple of days, and then they're digested and absorbed through the small intestine, and they are the main protein source for the animal. So they provide around 70 to 90% of the protein that a ruminant actually needs, and they're digested later on in the stomach, in the abomasum, but we'll look at that in a second. So basically, when we're talking about microbes or microorganisms, we're talking about three types that are in the rumen reticulum. So the number one here is actually in the middle, bacteria. They're the most plentiful, and then we have fungi and protozoa in there as well. You can see a picture here of a rumen, and you can look elsewhere as well. There's a few videos on YouTube on the barkerag.com website. But here you have down the bottom this liquid phase of the rumen, and then you have this thing called the mat, which is much more like fibrous and kind of undigested plant material up the top with a lot less or very minimal liquid. And so you have these two different areas, and then the third area is the top, which is mostly gases that are being produced, such as methane. So the different microbes in the rumen have different digestive roles, and there's two main groups, as mentioned a second ago. The slow-working fiber digesters, which are in the mat, which is up here, and then the fast-working microbes that float around in the rumen fluid, which is down the bottom of the rumen. And this stuff's kind of turned over as it's broken down. But the ones in the bottom in the liquid are ones that are looking for things that are easy to digest, like sugar and starches. What also happens, the stuff that's here in the fiber mat, if it's quite undigested, it gets sent back up, where we have rumination or chewing of the cud, where the ruminant animal sends it back to their mouth to get chewed again, sends a ball of lowly digested food up to its mouth to get chewed, to increase the surface area, and then it goes back down again to the rumen and hopefully to the bottom, where it can be further digested. So the food that a ruminant is eating is going to determine what microbes are present in the rumen. So this bit here says, because each group of microbes has a specific function, such as digesting fiber, digesting starch, digesting sugar, or digesting protein, the numbers of each are directly related to the diet. And a minimum amount of longer fiber particles to form the rumen mat is required for optimal microbe production. So what we have here is we know, or we need to know that when you put an animal, a ruminant, such as a cow or a sheep, particularly cows, when you put them in feedlots on a grain diet, you need to have a minimum amount of roughage, and usually we kind of have a minimum of 20% roughage and up to 80% grain. That's important for these longer fiber particles to be in the diet, and so that the microbes digest that, and that's also to keep the digestive system functioning properly and not to get bogged down with too much heavy, energy-intense grain. So the type of feed, especially the amount of fiber, influences the type of microbe, the speed of digestion, and the total intake of dry matter and nutrients. So when you're changing a ruminant, a cow for example, from a roughage-based diet, so they're just eating grass out in the paddock, you need to slowly change them over time and slowly increase the amount of grain that you're giving them when you put them into a feedlot, because the actual microbes in their rumen need to change over time, and you need to do that slowly if they if you don't do that, you can get grain poisoning, which is mentioned here. So one of the side effects of grain overload or grain poisoning is bloat. Bloat can also occur when a cow is grazing lush legume pasture suddenly, such as clover and lucerne. Bloat is, I think you know what bloat is, but it's where the stomach expands, the digestive system expands due to excessive gas, and that's often one of the symptoms of grain poisoning, when they're given a large amount of grain suddenly after being on a pasture diet. So we look at this later, but you need to change their diet from pasture or grass to grain rather slowly. So moving on, one of the features of a ruminant digestive system is it allows for a high proportion of cellulose to be digested and become available as energy. So cellulose is the main component of plant cell walls. So animals don't have cell walls because they have a skeletal system, so they don't need it, but plants have cell wall or cellulose to hold the plant up, so they have a lot of that. Ruminants can actually make use of that and digest that because of the microbes in their stomach, whereas monogastrics such as humans can't do that as readily, except the hindgut fermenters such as horses, but we'll talk about that later. So you should write in here, this bit here, the 4 compartments to the ruminant stomach in order are, and we have rumen, reticulum, omasum, and abomasum in order. So rumen, reticulum, omasum, abomasum, which you should know already. So microbes in the ruminant also allow synthesis or creation of vitamins B and K. So ruminants don't actually have to have much vitamin B and K in their diet. They can actually create it in their stomach, which can't be done. They can create it in their rumen and reticulum, which can't be done in the monogastric. So what happens with the process of rumination and the microbes? So food is in the rumen for about 30 hours, which is quite a long time. It's mechanically mixed and fermented. So fermentation is what's occurring here. The microbes are fermenting the food that they get. So this is an important point, an important word here, fermentation. The coarse material is regurgitated to the mouth. This is what I said before about chewing of the cud. It's re-chewed and swallowed again to increase the surface area of the food, and it's called rumination or chewing of the cud. The microorganisms such as the bacteria, protozoa, and fungi are number one bacteria, and then also fungi and protozoa in their number or volume. These microorganisms become established soon after the calf begins to eat solid food. So obviously when the calf is born, it's drinking milk, and it doesn't need to be able to digest roughage and grass and that kind of thing early on. But once it starts eating solid food, the microbes, the microorganisms build up in its stomach, in its rumen, in its reticulum, and allow it to digest the cellulose, etc. And so this is an important point here. The rumen of a fully grown cow can have a capacity of 150 litres. So that is clearly enormous. It is the largest component inside internally in a cow. And you can imagine, if you think of, say, a 2 or 3 litre milk container, how many times you'd have to have, if you had a 3 litre milk container, there'd be 50 of them, or a 2 litre one, you'd have 75 of them. So that's a large amount of space. Okay, so carbohydrates. We'll look at carbohydrates and protein here. Carbohydrates primarily coming from grain, hay, and mature pasture. So microbes break down carbohydrates into simple sugars by releasing enzymes. So the microbes themselves release enzymes, and the enzymes work at breaking down the carbohydrates. So these simple sugars that it's broken down into are then taken up and eaten by the microbes. And the result is they release volatile fatty acids, and the ruminant uses these for energy directly as they're absorbed through the rumen wall. And you can see down here, the volatile fatty acids are acetic acid, propionic acid, and butyric acid. And they're also, the microbes themselves actually also use the volatile fatty acids as energy for their own growth. And that's what's known as a symbiotic relationship, where both the ruminant and the microbes benefit. One of the side effects of this process of carbohydrate breakdown by the microbes is that there's a large amount of carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane produced. And so this is a large issue that ruminants produce a large amount of methane, which contributes to the greenhouse effect. So This is something, an area for future research in terms of reducing the methane produced by cattle, but that's an important point there. Okay, so in terms of carbohydrate breakdown, just putting those things up above into words, microbes secrete enzymes which break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars. Those sugars are taken up by the microbes and turned into VFAs, volatile fatty acids, acidic, propionic, and butyric, and they're absorbed into the blood as energy through the rumen wall, and we have carbon dioxide and methane produced. Now we look at protein, which we primarily get from lucerne or legumes, and protein is itself in the feed, is broken down in the rumen through the activity of the microbes. They're the first broken down into amino acids, which are the base component of protein, and then some are further broken down into ammonia. And then some of this ammonia is used by the microbes for their own energy as well, and some is absorbed into the blood of the animal. Non-protein sources are synthesized by the microbes. So this is one of the unique features of microbes here and the rumen, is they can create protein from non-protein sources, because the microbes themselves end up getting digested later on when they die after a couple of days, and they become a form of protein, even though they've been eating non-protein sources. And one of the examples is urea, which we'll talk about later. So when the microbes themselves are digested, and this happens later in the abomasum, which is known as the true stomach because it's most like ours, most like the monogastric, chemicals are released in the abomasum which kill and break apart the microbes, and they're digested as a protein source. And so, as I mentioned, therefore the microbes are able to make protein from non-protein sources. And this is what we call upgrading. So they can take a feed that is low in protein, and they can get good growth rates out of it, good muscle development from the protein that they create from food that's low in protein. And often these ruminant animals, cows and sheep, are eating poor quality pasture, which might be quite low in protein, but they can create protein. And lastly here, it's common practice to supplement the diets of ruminants with urea. This is an important point, which is broken down into ammonia, which in turn is used to make microbial protein. So that this is where the microbes can make protein with urea, which might be added to a diet. Okay, so to put that into a flowchart, microbes break protein and non-protein nitrogen into amino acids. Some further broken into ammonia, absorbed into the blood, then to the liver. And secondly, undigested and microbial protein moves to small intestine, is broken into amino acids and absorbed through the small intestine wall. The liver uses some amino acids and released to other tissues for use. Okay, so just in summary, outlining some points for about the relationship between ruminant and microbes. The ruminant and microbes are in a symbiotic relationship, which means it's beneficial for both. That's the meaning of symbiotic. The main type of microbe is bacteria, but we also have protozoa and fungi present. Microbes are effectively in control of digestion in a ruminant. And this next point illustrates that producers need to focus on feeding the microbes rather than feeding the ruminant animal. So you need to keep the microbes functioning and the microbes healthy and happy, and that will in turn be good for the animal. And lastly, microbial digestion has advantages such as vitamin production. Looking at the past HSC questions here, from 2012 we have a question on ruminant animals achieving high growth rates on a diet containing only low quality protein. So the feature of rumen microbes that allows this to occur is the ability to A, digest cellulose, B, synthesize amino acids, C, produce B group vitamins, or D, synthesize volatile fatty acids. Now, because this question says high growth rates and low quality protein, the answer is B. However, A is true, and C is true. They can do that, and they can do that as well, and this. But the one that's most correct in this answer is B, synthesizing or making amino acids, and the reason is because it says getting high growth rates despite having low quality protein. So it's not really referring to cellulose, and it's definitely not. You're not going to get high growth rates from vitamins, but making protein is going to allow for high growth rates on a low quality protein. So that is the answer for that question. 2011, why do pigs produce less methane than cattle or sheep? The first thing you need to do here is identify that pigs are monogastrics and sheep are ruminants. That's the first thing that the markers would be after. And then the second thing is one of the byproducts of microbial digestion in a ruminant, so the digestion of carbohydrates in the ruminant animal through fermentation. This is a good term to put in here, carbohydrates and fermentation. Shows you know what you're talking about. And the byproduct of that is large amounts of methane production. So obviously that means the cow or the sheep is going to produce a lot of methane. However, the question's asking about pigs, and so to finish it off, as pigs are monogastrics and do not have microbial digestion in stomach, they do not produce as much methane.